All right. It's good to see the energy. Thanks for sticking with us. We're down to the last part of the presentation. It's my pleasure to introduce Dan, and I've met him for the first time today. Dan is Vice President at ATRI, the American Transportation Research Institute. Prior to that, he worked for Regional Transit Board in Minneapolis as a project administrator. He has spent several years working in Chicago area as well. He is on numerous boards. He guides the portfolio of research for ATRI, so I can't think of a better person to run the Trucking Economic Trends and Minitrends than Dan. So Dan, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. I think I'm live. I don't think anybody in the room except for maybe Chris and Steve have had the misfortune of hearing me speak before. Is that true? Okay, so my general MO is this. I have about 640 slides. I promised to get everyone out by breakfast, so I'm going to speak really fast. But generally, what I'm going to do is fly through a bunch of issues. Obviously, mega issues are huge for us. We're going to talk through those. I officially am supposed to leave some time for Q&A. If I'm smart, I'll burn up all my time and get out of the room fast before I can create any new brush fires. So I'm going to go through a bunch of issues, but I do like the idea if somebody has a burning question to certainly raise your hand and just throw it out there and we can discuss that. So for starters, ATRI is a 501c3. We're not allowed to lobby or advocate. In fact, Chris is on my research advisory committee. I'll show you that in a second. But we do research in all these different areas. So I would sort of say, you know, I'm a transportation and trucking generalist. All of our research is available free online at our website. Feel free to go peruse it. We have 30 to 40 some research initiatives underway at any one time. Slightly more than half our research is funded by the public sector. We work with academia, industry, et cetera, et cetera. I do have a board of directors made up of presidents and CEOs of these small companies. But I also have, more importantly, because none of those folks are in the room, a research advisory committee that's made up of industry, carriers, suppliers, academia, federal government, state government. And these folks get together once a year and on several webinars to sort of discuss and debate critical issues. And they create a research agenda for us. It becomes our marching order. I think you see C.H. Robinson right here, and there's some others certainly recognizable. Many of the research initiatives that I'm going to talk about today were identified by the RAC, as we call it, and we'll cover those. So the first thing I'm going to do is talk about economics in the trucking industry. It's going to be whirlwind. I'm mostly trying to give you information and data. The analysis piece, that comes when we're holding a beer or a glass of wine. But so for starters, everyone knows truck rail intermodalism is the fastest growing sector of the freight industry, and that's because it's so small. First of all, is anybody from the railroad industry in the room? Okay, well then I can be candid. Is anybody from government in the room? Oh, it's going to get better. Okay, so rail intermodalism is always the fastest. That's because the amount of manufactured freight in the United States, if you doubled it today, would not hit 5%. Ironically, if you doubled it today, you'd lock up the Class 1 rail networks. Are already close to locked up thanks to oil and other things. So this is sort of the percentage growth, which looks amazing. Probably far more important is this chart, which is in the next dozen years roughly, the trucking industry is just going to get bigger. And there's so many factors influencing that I'm going to talk about. And again, if you have some insights afterwards, I certainly want to hear about those. But the share is going to get larger. Everyone's share of the pie is getting bigger, but the trucking industry is just going to get larger. Here we have GDP. If you look at 2000, and this is really loud, I don't know if I'm doing that or if the mic is. If you look at this GDP here, this is decent growth. If you're an economist, you'd say, oh, we like that 3 and 3.5%. But the truth is, if you like that sort of growth, you also like inflation. And I don't like inflation, so this is a much better stable growth pattern. We're generally pretty happy about that. By the way, ATRI, which was created by the American Trucking Associations in 1954, we're sort of the research arm and data arm of the ATA. We're separate, legally separate. We're part of the ATA Federation. So they take my data, I take theirs, and that's why you'll see a whole bunch of different slides and logos up here. Economic indicators. We love housing because people have a bad habit of moving heavy goods to build a house, and then they run to Target, Lowe's, Home Depot, et cetera, to stock it. So this is a great indicator for us. 14 was great, 15 is better. Factory output, 4% is wonderful. And personal spending, remember the consumers those terrible people are 2/3 of our country's GDP, so that's a very good indicator. Consumer spending, again, it's doing well. We saw a little blip last month for consumer confidence. Ignore that. We disconnect consumer confidence from spending because no matter how fickle they are on the confidence side, they continue to go to the stores and buy stuff. We even saw that during the Great Recession. Jobs and pay. So essentially, this is the unemployment rate going down. This is the amount of wages going up, and you're going to see that happening in the trucking industry as well. It's phenomenal for truck drivers in terms of the shortage issue. It's not so much if you're a shipper or consumer, because you will be paying more shortly, and we'll walk through that. Loads, again, stable. You can see little dips here and there. Some of those were weather-related in 2013 and 14, but generally, it's a stable growth for truckload. LTL had a much harder time getting out of the doldrums here. You see, truckload is a phenomenal leading indicator of the recession ending back here. LTL, was suffering, but now, ironically, capacity was so tight in the truckload industry that LTL started capturing 1,000-pound loads and up, and they were sort of cannibalizing little chunks of truckload. So that certainly helped them out in this neck of the woods. For-hire tractors. Now, this is interesting because essentially, if we use capacity and sales and orders as sort of a surrogate of each other, 2013, which is tractor sales, that's very, very misleading. 2000, because this is year over year, 2011 and 12 were so phenomenal that this was just sort of a regrouping time period. This is a much better indicator. In fact, Class 8 tractor sales and trailer sales hit their high time ever in the fourth quarter of 2014 in terms of sales. So it looks like a banner economy, at least for the trucking industry. We're going to walk through a couple of the top industry issues in my mega trends. I just want to show you this. Every year we survey thousands of trucking industry executives, drivers, managers, et cetera, and we come up with a David Letterman top 10 list, so to speak. And if you look at this over the years, which you can do if you request this report, it's a great barometer of what's coming and going in terms of fuel prices, regulation. We use it ourselves to say that might not be as big an issue. We're watching truck parking, in fact, climbing this list. And that's sort of, again, an indirect indicator of traffic congestion, driver shortage, and a series of other regulatory things I'll talk about in a second. But this is an interesting list for us. And you'll see that many of these things become mega trends in and of themselves. Hours of service, driver shortage, CSA, driver retention, even the ELD mandate, electronic logging device, EOBRs, you cannot separate the cause and effect from all of those issues in terms of what it's doing to the trucking industry and the driver shortage issue. And that's one of my first big mega trends, in fact. So the driver shortage crisis, I promise you the word crisis right now, at least in a 3 to 5 year time period, is almost an understatement. It's a perfect storm of every regulation coming down at the point of baby boomer retirements and a series of other issues I'll walk through. One of the first things that borders on terrifying is we went and looked at census data to sort of say, what is the inherent capacity of the workforce to generate truck drivers at all? Pretend you had all the compensation and you had all the health and benefits you want to put out there into the marketplace. What we looked at is basically the workforce by age. Now, this is hard to see, but these are the young kids, 20 to 24, 65-year-olds. And back in the day, the trucking industry essentially, and it's hard to see, but this is truck transportation here. So, we're 5% of the folks back in this time period were in that 20 to 21. And as you shift, you see that the trucking industry is just getting older and older. So if our peak was over here and now it's over here, we're getting close to as much as 10% of our population is 65 plus years old. Now, I cheer those folks on. Many of them could not retire when they wanted to because of the Great Recession, but I'm confident they will start to do that over the next 3 to 5 years. There is a strong relationship, unfortunately, between this huge advocacy in our country of getting your 4-year college degree or a 2-year associate's and the relationship of the truck driver population. And we have a different one that looks at age by college degree, and the trend lines are much worse. So not only do we have a problem with not enough of a supporting workforce for the whole U.S. economy, but the trucking industry is substantially worse. So I don't have any good news for you, so I'll move on in that one. But that is an issue. I mean, we are investigating. We always like, and with good research, you always have future research needs, and that's one of the shortest paragraphs in this report. But we are looking at opportunities. Department of Labor, military has always been a good source for us. The female gender population is good. We've started working on automatic transmissions, improved seatbelts, and a series of other things. But it's not a pretty picture. Then you have the hours of service to add to that perfect storm. Mostly there's so many pieces of the hours of service right now, it's a moving target. But the most controversial piece was on July 1, 2013. FMCSA passed this 34-hour restart thing. It was a bad piece of research that justified the rulemaking. It was really quite political. I'm saying that because my friends from FMCSA are not in the room. But it was so bad that the Inspector General and the GAO, the General Accountability Office, and Congress itself literally research-wise negated the benefits of this 34-hour research, and Congress sent them back to do it again. But what we did in terms of qualitative surveys of drivers and carriers, hundreds and hundreds, we said, remember, the whole goal of FMCSA's 34-hour restart, primarily, I'm going to simplify it, is to move truck drivers out of nighttime driving into daytime. Because of circadian rhythm, we're all more tired at 2 a.m. than 10 a.m., and we know that. So when we went and said, how is it working for you? Essentially, 60-some% of the drivers out there said, I'm somewhat to substantially more fatigued under the new rulemaking. Pay impacts. Well, again, if you say pay is unchanged to decreased, you have, essentially 2/3 of all drivers saying under this new supposedly beneficial rulemaking, I'm now substantially more fatigued, and 2/3 of the drivers out there making less money. So that's problematic. We're making up, and by the way, that's normalized for the hours of service itself. We know that we're paying more now in terms of bonuses and wages, but for different reasons. When you look at the FMCSA research, they did a field test. They were required to do it to justify it. Looked at 106 drivers. There's 3.25 million large truck drivers in the United States, and they analyzed 106 of them to sort of substantiate the rulemaking. Now, what's very interesting about that is they analyzed a whole bunch of metrics. One of them was the fatigue group versus the rested group, we'll say for simplicity. The rested group got 6 minutes more sleep in a duty cycle than the fatigue group, 6 minutes. Now that's not going to be recuperative in any sleep apnea or sleep experts, regimen, but it was 6 minutes more. On this Carolina self-assessment test, both groups described themselves as fully rested. The fatigue group was as fully rested as the rested group, but the one you'll love, if anybody in the room for the trucking company that has lane departure warning systems? Okay, so these are these things that sort of give you alerts if you're going between the lines. The deviation between the rested group and the fatigue group based on lane deviation was 1 millimeter. Now the resolution of these devices is not even in the centimeters generally, but through the wonders of mathematics and statistics, they came up with the rested group deviated 1 millimeter less than the fatigue group. So they submitted that to Congress, and Congress said, you're going back to the drawing board, and that's where they're at now. But the most important thing is they acknowledged that the goal is to move the trucks and the drivers into daytime hours. If you look at their sister agency across the hallway, which is the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, NHTSA has calculated that the crash risk of driving during the day is nearly twice as high as when you're driving at night. So the goal here was safety, and it's less safe, and driver health and wellness, and they're substantially more fatigued, and on top of that, you're taking more money out of my pocket. So Congress has sent them back. Now they're going to do a study of 288 drivers, a hair more than twice as many as the last one, and we'll just wait to see what that study comes up with. But this is a major issue for us. Truck driver turnover. The truck driver today is so concerned about leaving one company and joining another one and maybe not being able to be rehired because of a safety program called CSA and PSP, Pre-Employment Screening Program. Those two programs together essentially have booted out about 5 to 10% of the truck drivers in the industry. So they're terrified that if they leave one company, they won't be able to get back in. So in the old days, you'd see turnover, in a good economy, turnover rates for large truckloads easily 120% per year. And that's when you already calculated in the veteran drivers who've been there for 30, 40 years. Now we haven't really hit 100% yet, and this economy, by any metric, is hotter than the 2005-06 economy. So the drivers are not churning as much. So now we have a better sense of what's really churning versus what truly is a shortage. And this, unfortunately, is what the shortage looks like based on a report that was done by ATA. So, and at the end of the day, what we have is somewhere between today a need for 80 to 100,000 truck drivers today. I know, and you probably do too, dozens of trucking companies that have turned down loads because they can't put a driver in the cab. So this is an issue for us. Shortening of supply chains and truck trips. Now this is one of those sleeping giants that has something to do with the driver shortage problem. If I can't get the drivers home once a week, maybe once every week and a half, they're going to leave the industry because quality of life is, I want to see my family. So this tightening of supply chains and truck trips, we even presented at the Transportation Research Board in January, we're seeing some very interesting things that's very sort of intuitive for you. First of all, shipments are going crazy. Truck vehicle miles traveled are going way up. So we know the industry is growing. So how in the world do we explain miles per truck, this is right off the odometer, essentially a solid decrease that's very, very stable and seems to have a sort of a linear trend downward. Average truck trip lengths are going down. And then finally, we know that now this is essentially, it's hard to read, but it's commodities shipped by length of truck trip. Less than 50 miles, this is your courier services, your local P&D, and that's always been stable. But what we're seeing now is a slow growth, and this is in a 5-year period. All of these now, we're seeing the truck trips for those commodities in that range are starting to grow. And essentially what that means is even the truckload carriers are taking advantage of that vision that LTL has of hub and spoke, and we're doing much, much shorter truck trips for truckload. We're doing, drop-in hooks, team driving, and everything. So we're seeing the truck trip lengths get smaller and smaller. We're seeing distribution centers being built in huge, huge numbers. In the old days, Walmart bragged about having 12, and now they have 137, I believe it is. So we're reconfiguring the industry for shorter truck trips. Now, the bad news is this is going to wreak havoc on urban congestion. I present every year at the Norfolk Southern annual meeting. They're good folks and like to hear about trucking, I guess. And they're very nervous because truck rail intermodalism, as Eastern coal disappears on them, and it's disappearing by the day, they were hoping the revenue stream would come from truck rail intermodalism. When the truck trips get, on average, well under 500 miles, we're no longer in their sweet spot. So they're terrified. And just off the record, not like I have lunch with this gentleman, but Warren Buffett mostly bought BNSF for 2 reasons. They had access to the oil fields, and they were the first railroad that had truck rail revenue as their #1 revenue source. So I'm sure everyone's sort of watching this fact that truck trips are getting really, really smaller, and it's going to create some intense congestion issues for us. But it does sort of address somewhat the driver shortage problem because drivers get home more often and satisfaction goes up, which then leads us into mega congestion. And what does that mean? Well, first of all, we're fighting on a daily basis with Congress to give us a new highway bill. We typically have a 6-year transportation bill, and the last 2 have been 2-year bills, and they've essentially been continuing resolutions to keep the Highway Trust Fund afloat. In fact, we started borrowing from the general fund for the transportation system because Congress won't give us a 6-year bill, and it's a bipartisan problem. The trucking industry, believe it or not, is begging for a fuel tax increase. I think every state trucking association, there's 50 of them, along with the ATA, along with the Truckload Carriers Association, along with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, everyone has said, please raise the fuel tax. And for some reason, people say, you can't afford 15 cents a gallon in a fuel tax right now. The economy is still sensitive and tenuous. So what we're going to do is we're going to charge you $1.50 a mile in tolls, and we're going to start tracking your GPS and debiting your bank account. I assure you, because we've run the numbers on those are some of the most inefficient mechanisms for raising revenue you will ever see. Are there any economists in the room? Oh, come on, you can admit it. Okay, so the federal government spends 0.2 cents on the dollar to manage the federal fuel tax, 0.2 cents on the dollar. States, on average, spend 2 to 3 cents on the dollar to manage state fuel taxes. The cheapest toll, and we collected the financials for all these toll authorities, the cheapest toll authority system in terms of their administrative cost was 28 cents, and some of them went up to 40 cents on the dollar went into just administering the toll. Now, when they got into what they call, free flow speeding and free flow tolling, where you don't have to stop, the admin fee went down to 15 to 20 cents. It's highly inefficient. Nobody's calculated exactly what the cost will be for what this MBUF is, mileage-based user fee, but literally, Oregon is testing it now. It's a GPS unit in your device, in your car, excuse me. It will monitor all your miles, calculate an amount, and debit your bank account. The RAND Corporation says that'll be at least $10 to $12 billion to build before any money will go into the trust fund. So some of these propositions make us very nervous in the trucking industry. We think, just raise the fuel tax 15 cents. So a couple interesting things. We're working with the US DOT to sort of calculate what the impact is of a good economy and essentially growing vehicle miles traveled on the transportation system. And we do this with an interesting program we've developed at ATRI. It's sort of, we do so much different research that we fear we're going to become the American Truck GPS Research Institute. But we've cut some deals with the industry, and we now monitor in real time over 600,000 trucks in North America. You just watch the flows. It's really cool stuff, and I'm not a GIS guy, but I love this stuff now. So we monitor the flows, and we can see where truck volumes are growing. We can see where congestion points are. We can see what trucks do when there's the I-35 bridge drops in Minneapolis. And you probably heard about 3 to 4 hours ago, a I-35 bridge in Texas just dropped. I was hit by a truck, unfortunately. And this stuff is so cool that I had somebody at break in our Atlanta office quick run the numbers before and after the Texas bridge dropped 3 hours ago, and I'll show you what that looks like. It's kind of neat. So, well, tragic, but so if you were to take 1,000 trucks in Chicago, just as an example of what the truck network looks like and what it's going to become. So this is a 1,000 truck sample at point X in Chicago over a time sequence. In one day, that network looks like this: 2 days, 3 days, 5 days, 7 days. So essentially, this is a truck network for Chicago based on a 1,000 truck sample, which is infinitesimally small, of course. It also gives pause to my Class 1 railroad friends when they say, well, we're going to cannibalize the trucking industry. Because I say, well, you have to have a rail network that looks like that, and they don't. So this is a 1-week snapshot. There's no road-based map on there. That's just a satellite view of the United States. And what's really interesting is my friends in North Dakota this used to look like a black hole. And thanks to fracking and everything else, along with the Canadian oil sands going up this way, those folks are showing up on the radar screen quite literally. So we analyze these bottlenecks. We essentially collect up all these truck speeds. We calculate the deviation from free flow because we can capture their spot speed right off the engine, and we come up with this top list of the worst bottlenecks in the country. Up until this year, the Chicago Circle Interchange was the absolute worst bottleneck in the country for 4 straight years. Is anybody from Chicago in the room? Okay. That's a hideous place to be driving. And I lived there for 5 or 6 years as well. Well, former Illinois Governor Pat Quinn announced 2 years ago that he was so sick of being on the ATRI FHWA top 10 bottleneck list that he's commissioning a study to redesign it. A year and a half ago, the legislature bonded $475 million to reconstruct it. So it's proof that if you're enough of a gadfly out there, you can make a real difference in transportation. And we've done that. Hence, they're starting to drop down the list. And the George Washington Bridge, which dramatically increased its tolls, is now number 1, and we're hoping they'll call us up and say, what can we do? So the bottleneck system for monitoring congestion in the U.S. has become very important. It's going to Congress now. We're trying to create, the trucking industry, is trying to create a bottleneck program within the next transportation bill that'll focus exclusively on getting rid of these bottlenecks. And the reason that's important is if you just look at the lost time on the interstate system, which is only 55,000 miles in the US, it's almost $10 billion in lost hours in terms of deviation from the speeds we would normally be attaining due to congestion. In fact, it's the equivalent, if you calculate it on a driver per hour basis, of idling 51,000 drivers every year in the United States. And remember, we have a driver shortage problem, and many of them, unfortunately, are sitting in congestion. And if any of your drivers are paid by the mile, that means they're making 0 money which keeps them very unhappy. Cost of congestion, again, this has gone to Congress because we've said, okay, it's never going to be enough money to resolve our infrastructure crisis, but we've determined that at least on the interstate system, 89% of lost productivity associated with truck congestion is associated with 12% of the interstate miles. Focus on 12% of the interstate miles and you can eliminate or at least address 89% of all truck industry congestion on the interstate system. So it does give us hope, and it's become sort of a talking point, at least in Congress, when we're supposed to have a new bill as early as this May. That's not happening, but we're hopeful that by the end of 2015. Changing financials. In fact, we heard a little bit today about things like increasing driver wages, but we're also seeing dramatic increases in the cost of a truck. A new truck now, 2015, I won't use the brand names, but you're not going to pay under $125,000, $130,000 per truck. When there's new EPA rumors coming out in 14 or 16 with new engine requirements, at least Cummins has estimated that every EPA mandate, which we had in 2004, 7, and 10, every one of those mandates added almost $12,000, $7,000 to $12,000 per engine to the cost of a truck. So these trucks are moving houses, moving mortgages, and so we're seeing a lot of changes in what that means to folks who are trying to buy them. So we collect up under confidentiality agreements a massive amount of operating data and financial data from trucking companies, and you can start to see line items, and it'll calculate it by per mile and per hour, and you can start to see interesting line items over the years. If you look at permits and licensing, when government figured out they weren't going to get any new taxes, watch licenses and fees and registration costs skyrocket up to 4 cents a mile. Now they're coming down again. But we are seeing tires going up. This is because, first of all, they're petroleum-based, and that was getting expensive until recently. And number two, the demand for new trucks and trailers is so high that the tire industry can't keep up with the sales and orders of the trucks and trailers, so the cost of tires is going way up. You'll also see repair and maintenance start to go down again. Finally, we are keeping these trucks really, really old during the Great Recession. Now we're starting to buy again. You saw the sales orders are just phenomenal. One of our previous speakers was talking about how we're selling these trucks off. If you believe in global warming, the bad news is these trucks are still operating in the world. If you're focusing on U.S. air quality, it's great news because we've been shipping them off to Asia and Africa and everywhere else. But air quality in the U.S. is phenomenal now because these are some of the cleanest running trucks we've ever had. But anyway, I urge you to take a look at this because among other things, July 2008, diesel fuel hit its highest point ever in the trucking industry's history. It was the first time in our history that fuel surpassed labor cost as the number one line item. Now it's back down and labor's back up there. But I don't foresee any dramatic decrease in fuel from this point on. So fuel and labor will always be our highest. But now watch, labor costs are going up. Now somebody says, well, wait a minute, the labor costs are not going up last year dramatically. Why is that? Well, there was such an influx of new entry-level truck drivers because we were basically, banging on elementary schools saying, please come out and drive a truck, that the entry-level driver pay sort of moved the average down. But if you go to any trucking company and say, talk to me about your veteran drivers in terms of wages, you'll see that skyrocket. Again, you can look at this per hour. And the government uses this too. So 68, 65, 67 bucks an hour across all sectors is pretty common now. You can go to get the report and break out sectors and regions. But I want to focus a little bit then on the pay for the truck driver. If you look at all carriers on average, and it's a median, so we're not necessarily having that influence of the really expensive specialty trucks in North Dakota skewing this number, but a median, it's $54,000 with bonuses thrown in. It's not terrible, particularly for some 21-year-old who's still trying to find themselves. And many of the carriers are now paying for truck driver training school. So we know that we have some image issues. We have, beyond respect and image, we have the regulatory pressures, which are substantial. So this is a dilemma for the industry in total because I absolutely assure you, particularly as a shipper and a consumer, you're going to be paying substantially more because this will easily go up 10% in the next 12 to 14 months. Driver pay for sure, 10 to 12%. I'll take that one to Vegas or have a beer bet with you. So this is going up. But it probably is still not going to be enough to reach that sweet spot where we can sort of all relax. The good news is, by the way, fuel has gotten so expensive that all those drivers we lost to North Dakota and Texas and Pennsylvania are starting to come back to the industry. Many of them are, frankly, being given, you can drive for another 3 to 6 months here. But unless fuel or oil gets back up over $50 a barrel, things are calming down in the fracking industry. But this is also interesting, too, I believe. Bonuses are safe because they're essentially temporary. It's a one-time hit. But here's a sign-on bonus and referral bonuses. We have fuel management bonuses. We have safety bonuses. There's so many bonuses going out there, and some of them are getting very, very creative. And that's the way of sort of luring drivers back in based on compensation, but from managing the books, it doesn't have long-term liability. But at the end of the day, these bonuses will become substantial, pay will go up, and then at that point we're hoping we can manage that sort of negative trend in loss of drivers. Nevertheless, in this phenomenal economy, between regulatory pressure, some fuel pricing issues, quite candidly, this fuel surcharge is hurting us because the fuel prices are low, and then the cost of equipment and drivers. Look at this trend line, and this is for essentially the large truckloads. In a good economy, the average operating margin of a large truckload is going down from where it used to be. So now, we're floating a little above 4%, 3 to 4% across all truckloads. And what's even more terrifying, if you look at some data from Avondale Partners, it's really interesting to watch business failures. Hopefully none of those folks are in this room. But if you look at quarterly trucking failures, and this is for 5 or more trucks, this isn't the owner-operator who might be a chameleon and reincarnate next week, you can see essentially the economy going up and down, and it's no surprise. Here's the dot-com implosion where we were all going to be breathing and eating food on the internet. And then again, you see all of this. So here's our Great Recession here, but there is no rational basis for business failures in 12 and 13 when things were getting really good for both the trucking industry and the economy in whole. We cannot explain this. Now we can say these are the marginal guys who competition and everything else are being driven out. But this is interesting. It'll be very interesting to see the next year or two of data on business failures. At the end of the day, there are many, many carriers who say, and there really is between 500 and 600,000 trucking companies. I think somebody had a slide that said 1.5 million. That's the number of DOT numbers that the US DOT has, but a lot of those are subsidiaries of major fleets, and there's a bunch of them are landscaping companies, et cetera. But if you look at sort of medium to large trucking companies plus owner-operators, it's about 500,000. We thought that number would go down because we thought all of these small guys are going to go bankrupt and go out, and the big guys have those economies of scale, and they're investing in some phenomenal technologies. Unexpectedly, and we think it's because of regulations, about a year ago, US DOT released their newest list of new entrants, DOT number requests, registrations, and it went up substantially among these small guys. So at least one theory is they can't get gainful employment among the large trucking companies or mediums, so they're going to go set up their own trucking company. So a lot of us thought, well, the day of the small trucking companies going away like the dinosaurs did, but a lot of data is indicating that they're showing up in large numbers, at least for registrations at the US DOT. Now, I officially am supposed to end here, but if you know me, I don't. So I go on to my next slides. And I do that because I'm managing the time, and if I happen to run out of time right there, I can stop. But I have a couple more things. The driver detention. If you are a shipper, be scared, because FMCSA has overstepped. Nobody from FMCSA, right? Just repeat that. FMCSA, at least Congress believes, has overstepped their mandate. They now have a major study underway to assess the safety impact of driver detention in shipper facilities. And I'm privy to their methodology, and it's interesting. But essentially, the question is, when they come to a conclusion that these drivers lose so much time in detention that they're going to hit the road and race at top speed, somehow above their governed speed limit, I don't know. But the question is, will they then act on it? Do they have the authority to act on detention at the shipper facility? So we have done some research. We have a massive amount of research underway in driver detention. But if you talk to the drivers and say, first of all, driver and carrier, yellow and blue, and say, how bad is detention as a problem? I'm summarizing this for you. They are talking 1 to 4 hours for the vast majority of them. And if you go back and remember my operating costs, $68 an hour, and pretend he's an owner-operator, small carrier, you've absolutely, I shouldn't say you, somebody has absolutely wiped out their profit margin for that entire trip, just based on these detention numbers, if they're accurate. This is self-selecting, and frankly, there's probably an error on this side. If you ask about the impacts on productivity by commodity, general freight, this doesn't give us a lot to act on, but it does allow us to flesh this out in more detail, because we're going to be collecting this data over the next couple of years. We may also find ourselves on the FMCSA research team that's going to be studying this. It's quite possible to likely. Detention here, again, percentage of respondents who say, why is this occurring? I will make my PDF available. My PowerPoint will convert it to PDF and make it available to anybody who wants this. And essentially what's really interesting is it really comes down to the operational efficiency at the shipper, dock, and terminal. And this is stuff, is it possible to improve the efficiency of operations at the terminal? It's not so much, attitude and appointments and scheduling. It's basically when I get there, the total disorganization and nothing's ready and I can't figure out where to go kind of thing. So that is either good news or bad news. We're not really sure. But this issue over the next 12 months is going to be right at your doorstep, because at the end of 12 months, roughly speaking, FMCSA is going to Congress with their assessment of what driver detention at a shipper facility is doing to safety on the roadside. Now, officially, you think that's the end. Au contraire. So I did want to show you really quickly. This is the I-35 bridge. These are trucks. These are truck pings. Green means they're moving quite quickly. Red is they're stopped at facilities, rest stops, etc. And this is from yesterday. And then this is when the bridge went down. You'll see absolutely zero red right there because there's no truck activity. There's 2 to 3 hours of backup on either side because they just patently closed all lanes down just not too many hours ago. But watch this. There's no traffic here. That's a lie. You see a little bit of green activity here, but obviously free flow movement, supply chain efficiency is on the interstate. And then look at this. It's just rerouting. But believe it or not, that's a reflection on the dynamism of the industry, because they did not have any alternative routing signs up when we did this. So it's amazing. In fact, in I-40 Rock Slide in North Carolina, we watched, again, the trucks reroute, and the U.S. Start over, Dan. The North Carolina DOT put up alternative routing signs, and we went and looked at what the trucks were doing, and they absolutely were not doing that. They'd taken another route, slightly longer, but had no semaphores and stop signs and lower speeds. And we gave that to the North Carolina DOT, and they came up with a new alternative routing. But the industry is very dynamic, very fluid, and is able to essentially reroute and optimize on the fly. So I think that's kind of interesting. I just wanted to throw that in there. And there, as you can just see, more, thanks to Google Earth, more interesting snapshots. I truly believe this time I am done, and I can take questions and answers. If I may, before we do that, I have about 3 more hours of comments based on what all the other presenters had. Chris is absolutely right. By the way, I'm on the Auburn University team that's testing truck platooning. And I will tell you, no matter how bad the truck driver shortage gets, I go everywhere and I tell them, we will not take a driver out of that truck. If you want to talk about insurance liability, civil litigation, technology inaccuracy, we will never take a driver out. In fact, they were talking about caravanning, University of California, Berkeley, caravanning behind the lead truck who has a driver and everyone caravans empty. That will not happen in my lifetime, nor yours. I'm that confident of that. But the truck platooning does seem to show a fuel efficiency increase of 4 to 10% for the following truck. Problem is the lead truck gets 3 to 4%, but who the heck wants to be the lead truck when the guy behind you is getting all the benefits? So we're even getting into the business model of saying, how much does the second truck have to pay the first truck to be the lead and not get the fuel efficiency benefits? So it gets really interesting. I won't comment on Lean Six Sigma. Panama Canal, somebody asked about that. Absolutely, Norfolk Southern has massive capacity now that Eastern Coal is dying. The lowest labor costs are in Southeast United States. The highest average truck speeds based on our data are in the Southeast United States, and at least 4 major ports, including Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans, are all dredging like crazy as we speak to accommodate the Panamax Canal. So I'm very intrigued with that. Now, you can't get anything more than 12,000 TEUs through there, but there's a whole bunch of ships sitting over in LA Long Beach right now that would say, you know what, I'll take the Panama Canal any day. And I think that's it for my, oh no, I have one more. FMCSA has an app. The shippers are supposed to go look at a carrier's CSA scores and make decisions about that. Congress and the Inspector General has said, and they had these very professional ways of saying, that is a stupid idea. And the reason they did that is we did an analysis of CSA scores, and we calibrated CSA scores for carriers and drivers for the 5 public basics. And I'm not going to get into these percentile scores and alert scores. Does anybody know anything about the CSA? You are better people for not knowing about it. But at the end of the day, we proved with this painful thing called a linear regression analysis, and then the DOT's own research institute, which is called the Volpe Center, absolutely corroborated what we came up with. We found out that at least 2 or 3 of those basics are inversely related. Literally, with the driver fitness basic, the worse your score, the safer you are in terms of crash risk. The terrifying one, do we have any media in the room? Okay. The terrifying one was the drug and alcohol percentile score is inversely related. Quite literally, send your drivers out drunk and they'll be safer. And that's what literally the Volpe Center corroborated that. And now the crash basic, which has not been publicly released, also looks like there's an inverse relationship, that the more crashes you have initially, the fewer you'll have in the future. The insanity of that is there's no crash responsibility built into it. The DOT's own numbers say between 55 and 75% of all car truck crashes are caused by the car driver, but they all calculate up against the carrier's crash basic. So if they take those out, I think that will be a good indicator, but today it's a terrible indicator. So with all those inverse relationships being built in, the last thing anybody wants is for a shipper to trust the data that FMCSA is providing publicly on an app. So that's just based on the science of the system. I don't have any political iron in that fire. So with that, now I promise I'm done and can take questions.
Any questions? I had a question on your slide about the bottle drinking. I saw Atlanta had jumped here.
Can you speak up just a tad?
On your slide regarding bottlenecking, top 10 cities, Atlanta had jumped from 14 to 3 in 1 year. Was there any specific reason for that? What's happening in Atlanta that's causing all the bottlenecking?
I'd like to tell you, and it's true, that our largest ATRI office is in Atlanta. We share offices with the Georgia Trucking Association. We're doing so well. We've hired so many people. It's just bottlenecked the metro area. But that's not true. I don't know. We do know that we're tracking these over time very deliberately because things like work zones and incidents can have a pretty dramatic effect even in a 12-month time period. But I can't explain it. I will tell you that this is sort of the best bottleneck analysis out there. There's a company that collected commercial vehicle drivers and did their own analysis, and Atlanta had this huge bottleneck where we later discovered trucks are banned, but the commercial vehicle data they had was primarily taxis and limousines coming out of the airport. So we feel very comfortable that the data is quite accurate, but what sort of the underlying cause is, I'm not really sure. Sorry.
Dan?
Boy, they're making it easy on me.
I came into this somewhat excited about logistics, and I'm here now.
You know, I feel the same way. I don't go home and tell my wife a lot of good stories about transportation research.
I'm sure about that. I'm not in trucking anymore, but all right, so are we building any new concrete?
No. Truck tonnage is supposed to increase about 45% over the next, now 10 years. I think it'll be higher than that. The DOT's long-term plans are for 3 to 4% increase in infrastructure capacity. So that math is not going to work. So we are interested in things like truck-only lanes, longer combination vehicles. 2 major reports that the DOT are going to release within the next month or 2, mandated by Congress. One is to look at higher productivity vehicles, certain doubles and certain triples east of the United States, east of the Mississippi, not the U.S. And I'm very intrigued with that because they're collecting up safety data, and there's some early indicators that I'm not officially supposed to know about that say that these are at least as safe as a 5-axle. And if that's the case, that would be a huge opportunity, to improve productivity. The other one they should keep an eye on that's very interesting is what they call the Jason's Law Truck Parking Report. That'll be released within a month. a national assessment of truck parking issues, capacity and problems, both private truck stop and public rest stop. And we're very hopeful Congress will create a truck parking program in the next transportation bill, because that issue, in fact, Chris was as a research advisory committee assessing truck parking, and essentially the ideal truck parking locations in the United States was the #1 research advisory committee issue at the top of the list. It had the highest number of votes we've seen at RAC. So truck parking is huge. It relates to congestion, driver shortage, and a series of other things, staging in and out of major freight generators. So truck parking report will be out soon, and we're hoping that jumpstarts a lot of national dialogue on that.
What's your guess for fuel in the next year or two?
The fuel tax increase?
Price.
Oh, well, I could punt to the Energy Information Agency says it's going to be really stable. I secretly think we're at a sweet spot now where it shouldn't go down anymore because there's economic harm, believe it or not. If it doesn't go up much more, it's our best opportunity to say, fuel is so dirt cheap, this is the time to add an insignificant 15-cent fuel tax increase. Nobody's going to know or care. Throw out a number. How much do you think the fuel is regular, unleaded, today? I'm guessing, and you can throw out numbers, I'm guessing most of you don't really know. Plus or minus 50 cents? We don't even know, and people are complaining about a 10 or 15-cent increase. So maybe you do know. What is it, $2.40 a gallon? Not diesel, but unleaded. $2.40, $2.29. Okay, but you know what? Diesel fuel in July 2008 was $4.76 a gallon. And so the idea that we're half of that now, this is the time for a fuel tax increase, in my humble opinion. Remember, I'm not, as a researcher, I'm not supposed to have opinions. I'm not supposed to advocate. I'm not supposed to be editorial. But there's no insurers, railroad, government, or media in the room. You guys are my best friends.
So on that topic, Dan, what about where that 15% or 15-cent tax came in? What's the likelihood that it doesn't end up in the general fund, but truly is for infrastructure?
Yeah, and that's a good question, because back in a million years ago before I was born, but not really, we had that 4.3-cent deficit reduction tax that was added to the fuel tax, and they left that on for 5 or 6 years. So they're happy to raid those major trust funds anytime they can. I'm pretty confident that everybody has focused on transportation and acknowledges the need. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, who is run by Tom Donahue, who used to run the American Trucking Association, they've estimated transportation needs at $1 trillion. Our research at ATRI says about 500 to 600 billion for sure is needed. I think if we find money, the current idea right now, outside of tolling and some other things, is to repatriate corporate taxes. And that's a terrifying idea, because all the corporations will come running back with a lot of their savings accounts, and then all of a sudden all our fuel taxes, or road funds disappear. So I want something stable. Do I think we'll get 15 cents in the next year? No. Okay. After the next presidential election, I think I think both parties would stomach a fuel tax after the next election, but we're way too close to 2016 for that to happen, I think. That's just a political prognostication. Anything else?
Any others out there? I've got one final one.
And by the way, I want to send my appreciation. You gave me an hour.
Yep.
I truly have been asked by folks, can you come in and talk about the trucking industry? We're 5% of the country's GDP. We've given you 15 minutes, but we need 5 for Q&A. And I'm thinking, I'm just going to sit down and let somebody else do it. So I appreciate the hour. It was good.
We appreciate your hour. Last question. How many of your shippers buyer transportation? What should they expect from their transportation service providers in terms of budget pressure in the next year?
Well, now you're seeing rate increases of 4 and 5%, but I am confident driver wages will be double digits for sure. Service quality is going to be phenomenal, and I say this sincerely. This is going to sound really parochial. Class 1 railroad service is going to be a problem. They're getting sued. They're being sued on pricing. They're being sued by the grain industry. They're being sued by oil shippers. So there's a whole bunch of issues. I think the trucking industry's quality of service will be phenomenal. Pricing is absolutely going up, and that capacity, all those new truck sales I showed you in orders, is going into almost no new capacity. I think the calculation for 15 for new capacity is like 1.8% new capacity. Capacity is going to be ugly. It's going to come at a premium. Service quality, obviously, so it's not inflationary, should be as good or better than our price increase. But there's so much pressure because of the cost of equipment and driver wages that I won't quote an amount, but it's absolutely going up.
All right, thank you, Dan.